Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director at Books Are Magic, which, if you don't know, is a wonderful little indie bookstore just a couple blocks away from here. So before we get started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, of course, I want to give a huge thank you to Wild East Brewing Co. for letting us use this space for tonight's event. All attendees also get $1 off full large pours on all draft beers. So shout out to them for giving us that discount. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's event, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, our panelists will be available to sign books if you ask them nicely. And of course, we do have all of their books and magazines available for purchase tonight at the table where you checked in. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of these authors' books online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so with all that in mind, we are so excited to introduce tonight's Reading panel. Reading is a quarterly series curated and hosted by Michelle Philgate and co-sponsored by Literary Hub. The November panel is presented in collaboration with Liber, a feminist review. Reading makes one think of vitality, blood, the monthly cycle, correcting history, and making a mark on the world. This dynamic series focuses on women writers, past and present. Tonight, our discussion, centered on feminist publishing, features Jamia Wilson, Sarah Leonard, Bridgett M. Davis, and Debbie Stoller. The panel will be moderated by Jennifer Baumgartner and Karis Caputo. Jennifer Baumgartner moved to New York in 1992 to intern at Miss Magazine and was hired as an editor and later began writing for places like Dissent, Harper's Bazaar, The New York Times, and The Nation. Her books include Manifesta, Young Women, Feminism and the Future, Grassroots, and Look Both Ways, Bisexual Politics. She is currently the publisher of Daughter Press and of Liber, a feminist review. Karis Caputo is the senior editor of Liber and former assistant editor of Women's Review of Books. She holds an MFA in fiction from NYU. All right, let's give our moderators a very warm welcome, and I'll pass it off to them to introduce the rest of tonight's panel.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jennifer.
Jennifer Baumgartner. It's pronounced Lieber. It's so funny because you went back and you were like, I want to check everybody's name. How do you say your name? Jennifer Lieber. So I'm happy people came out. We're still kind of in that pandemic zone where it's like, should I leave? It's so cold. So I really appreciate that people made the effort. Our panelists are going to come on down when I say their name. But Sarah Leonard first is the editor-in-chief of Lux and a contributing editor to Dissent and also The Nation. Jamia Wilson is currently vice president and executive editor at Random House, and she was the director of Feminist Press until pretty recently. And she's the author of several books for young readers, including This Book is Feminist and Young, Gifted, and Black. Bridgett Davis is the author of the acclaimed memoir, The World According to Fannie Davis, My Mother's Life in the Detroit Numbers, which she's also writing. You wrote the screenplay already. It's being made into a movie, Plan B Entertainment, released by Searchlight Pictures. And I met Bridgett because she wrote this wonderful novel called Into the Go Slow, and I was the executive director right when it launched, and so we got to know each other then, and you've been an incredible friend ever since then, so that was nice. And actually, I'm acting like you're the only one I know. I know Jamia really well too, and I met Sarah recently, and we had like a wonderful tea at the Liber offices. Debbie Stoller is the person I've known the longest in this room. I met Debbie in 93 or 94, soon after you started Bust Magazine, the magazine for women who have something to get off their chest. Used to be the tag. Yeah, you're like, no. No tag now. And also, Debbie is the author of the New York Times bestselling knit and crochet book series, Stitch and Bitch. There are a lot of other books that you've done bust related, the Bust Craftacular. And you're a big component or proponent of lifting up activities, domestic activities that have been sort of written off in a way by feminism. I'm generalizing a little bit, and pointing to the the artistry and the work and the kind of pleasure of knowing how to do them, like knitting, cooking, etc. So those are our panelists, and Karis, I think you're going to ask some questions.
Sure. First of all, give it up for them. That was very fun. It's like we're on a game show.
Come on down.
So just to give a little context about why we're here, so Jennifer and I early this year started a print and online magazine called Weaver, dedicated to the discussion of feminist history, culture, and writing. And a big part of our mission was that we wanted to sort of call attention to and explore what we see as the deep connection between feminism and publishing. And just for a little context, in our first issue, we published a timeline of feminist publishing, starting with like Mary Wollstonecraft and a vindication of rights in women in the 1790s, and going, through the explosion of feminist presses and periodicals in the 1960s and 70s that sort of eventually brought feminist issues into the mainstream, and then into the third wave of zines and magazines and blogs and so forth. So the first question that I wanted to start with is just to ask each of you to say a little bit about, name a couple publications, books, magazines that were important in your formation, both as a feminist and as a writer or a publisher or editor. We can start. Yeah, go ahead. I'll start.
Obviously, Ms. was really instrumental for me. It came along at a time, I was a teenager. No, I wasn't. I'm not that old. When did it start? 1972? So I was pretty young. But its existence really made a difference for me, just knowing that it was there and being really stunned by that word MS. Because I think still people weren't using it that frequently, so it was really exciting and I took it on right away. I'm going to be Ms., even though I was probably 9 or 8 or something. But the other one that really was important to me was Essence Magazine, and in particular Marsha Gillespie, because Getting Down was something that I know I and all my friends read religiously, even before we were old enough to fully understand all of what she was saying. We knew she was talking to us, and that just hadn't happened before. So I think that would be it for me, those two. I'm passing the mic.
Yeah, he wants the mic.
All right, I'll do it. All right, I'll take the plunge. Oh, sorry, you want to? No, you can. Okay, I'm going to take the plunge. So the most important writing for my feminist journey was Gloria Steinem's essay called If Men Could Menstruate, which I read in high school from a very cool high school instructor called Ms. Albert, and I'm old enough that I think that essay probably had just come out shortly before we read it. And it really changed my thinking about understanding how we put different values on things based on whether they're associated with men or with women. And then in the 90s when Sassy magazine came along, it didn't change me as a feminist. I already was a feminist, but it blew my mind that there was a publication out there that was showing the way that I knew girls and women to be and feminists to be, rather than the wall of women's magazines that confronted us and a very narrow definition of women in pop culture that confronted us every day. To really show like the pleasures and the joys of being female rather than everything that was like terrible about it that you had to control. And then the writings of Barbara Ehrenreich, rest in peace, before she started doing her stuff about workers' rights and that kind of work, she wrote quite a few feminist books. Feminization of Sex and The Hearts of Men were really great cultural insights into men and women and culture that changed me a lot.
Love all of these books. I feel that I was really lucky to have a mother who was a Black feminist professor. Although she taught in the sciences, I just thought my mom was so cool. I wanted to do whatever she was doing, and so she would read Essence at the beauty parlor. And so I would want to be able to talk with the grown women about what they were talking about these op-eds by people like Charlene McRae and things like that were happening at that time. And also Ms., my mom subscribed to Ms. She gave me a copy of a Feminist Press classic, But Some of Us Were Brave. A very, very landmark book in my life, a beautiful book that you edited the new edition of, Jennifer, and so that book was a book that really helped me see myself for the first time in the conversation around feminism. And also Zora Neale Hurston, I love myself when I'm laughing, but then again, when I meet an impressive, Sassy magazine, Bust magazine, Manifesta. I was a teen at an all-girls school. I was started by Blue Stocking Feminists, so those were the archive that were being passed around with us, and all of those in the 90s. That was a time where I felt like it was a really fresh time to be a young feminist, learning and feeling that we could talk about theory and pop culture with equal values. So those are the texts, and also I feel like reading the Mary Shelley was really important to me in school as well, to kind of think about how these ideas have been around for a long time and feminism is evolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, I think I came of age as a feminist as I was graduating college, maybe. I always considered myself a feminist well before that, but it wasn't the center of my attention, and my thinking had really been on the left, in a way where a lot of the, I had dutifully read Marx. And one of the things that became part of my training was trying to figure out how do I actually begin to apply and expand and challenge these ideas through a feminist lens. So I was very interested in questions of capitalism and inequality and the role that those play in constructing gender, and vice versa. So that was very much a moment when a lot of feminist material had been sort of turned into consumer material. And it was all about marketing stuff on the basis of it being empowering and so forth. And I read a book called One Dimensional Woman, which sort of attacked that in this very, very polemical way, which at 22 I found thrilling, and that made me want to focus my attention on feminism. And from there, my politics really solidified when I read Bell Hooks' Margin to Center, which just offers a definition of feminism that makes sense. I thought, okay, that's the framework, and that's what I've been operating off of ever since. And I think at that time, you had things like Jezebel that were engaging directly with pop culture in a way that also made sense to me. They had a great essay I've never forgotten by Mo Tasic about how she, gird yourselves, forgot a tampon inside of her for like 2 weeks. And the essay gets progressively more gruesome. And what was funny about it was that it seemed to evade the male gaze. It was deeply unappealing, but it was also something you could kind of imagine doing. And her life in the process is also very chaotic and messy. And there was something I really liked about that type of writing, and so I think in thinking about how to make a magazine, it's been, can we combine sort of evading the male gaze a little bit with a sort of more serious politics that, comes from a Bell Hooks-like framework. And of course, when I was thinking about it, I looked to Ms. There's a big history of Ms., and I read it, and I thought about what they thought went right and wrong, and that was really helpful.
Can I add one?
Yeah.
Actually listening to you guys and thinking about this and thinking of the power of publishing and writing by women and the difference it makes, that in fact I think my very first gasp of recognition was when I read Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret.
Totally.
Right? This was like a truth-telling story written by a woman about girls. There were no other stories about girls that were being told. There were sanitized versions of what girlhood was about, and girlhood on television was never anything like it. It was all stories written by men. A story written by a woman who had been a girl that really told this truth was totally mind-blowing for me and important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that last one. That was one of the most important books in my life. And I read it with my son, who's now 18, when he was like 11. He let me read it to him out loud. Like, we'd lie in bed together at night before he went to sleep, and I would read it, and he was totally into it. And so then the younger one, I was like, he'll want to read it too. And he was like, but it was great to be able to talk about periods. And the older one, Schoolie, was curious, and the younger one was grossed out, I guess. I don't know. Now, Debbie, it was interesting when we were talking about Ms., even though you brought up the Men Can Menstruate, because when I first met you, I was working at Ms., Marcia Gillespie was my boss, and one of the things I remember kind of thinking this was great that you said this, but you were like, the reason we created BUS was basically because Ms. sucks. It should be so much better. It should be so much more funny and sexy and interesting and and I was starting to feel a little constrained myself, even though I loved Ms. and working there so much. And so I guess I'm just kind of telling on you that that's how you felt and what you said. But I wanted to ask Debbie and Sarah, since all three of us have started magazines, presumably kind of taking on that responsibility, and it's resource intensive when they're print magazines. So I just wanted to ask kind of what compelled you to create it, and do you regret it?
Who's answering first? Oh, I am? Okay. So, well, we started BUST in 1993, and it was like a hobby. We used to say we were tri-quarterly because we tried to be quarterly. Usually weren't. And we had full-time jobs, but basically, I had gone to grad school. I had studied the impact of pop cultural images on women's sense of themselves and power, and specifically back then in the 80s, all anybody talked about was women's magazines and how it caused anorexia, and women's magazines gave women such terrible images of themselves, which is surprising to me now because there's no women's magazines, and women still manage to find a way to have a terrible self-image, so we were wrong. There's something else actually, but anyway, we wanted to make a magazine that was the opposite of that sort of was like a magazine about feminist joy. Ms. was about feminist misery. And that's not that wasn't important. It was super important stuff. But I thought that has to be possible to have a magazine that isn't like regular women's magazines that make you feel like shit, but that make you feel good. And that are sort of from a feminist perspective. Things are a little bit thought through. Do I regret it? Well, it wasn't a very financially supportable business, and still isn't. But no, it was been super fun, and I'm so grateful that we were able to do it for almost 30 years now.
Wow, that's impressive.
That's incredible. Something to aspire to. Yeah, starting a magazine, obviously an insane thing to do. And I think for me, it was that I was living a political moment, which was the post-2008 political moment. So waves of protest of different sorts, the rise of a sort of young left, and a lot of the media that was being constructed out of that new left was pretty white and male, and the sort of problem that came out of that was a lot of the public intellectual work reflected that. It reflected the limitations of the founders. And second, that the media that you produce as a movement affects who you bring into the movement. So if it's legible to everybody, that all these publications are full of like white guys who think that anything to do with gender or race is a peripheral distraction from the coming revolution, you're going to get more of those people coming in, and it's a self-perpetuating problem, and it creates real political problems. And so for me, I felt like I was watching that with horror. I had worked at different more long-standing magazines like The Nation, and that was an interesting viewpoint where you could kind of see the old left interacting with the new left and kind of having the same problems again. And I just found it to be a disappointing landscape. And meanwhile, the sort of people I was most interested in reading, who I thought had the most creative political ideas, generally were feminist, for one thing, and the people who understood that the way that people experience the world is through a different set of identities that don't just have to do with class, includes class, but has to do with a lot of different identities. We're doing the most interesting and productive work in how you organize people to do stuff. So, you know, I think I became very interested in whether we could have a publication that reflected those conversations and that point of view, and also challenged sort of establishment political positions on the sort of liberal side of things from the left, but couldn't, you know, no one could say we weren't feminist. And so by that, I mean, we've had more than one piece that criticizes Planned Parenthood, for example, for their political strategy, which has failed. And, you know, I have volunteered for them when I was young, like I value their clinics, you know, these sorts of things. At the same time, there are large feminist organizations whose strategies have failed us. And so where are the critical voices going to come from within feminism to sort of have that conversation in a way that's not trying to get rid of those institutions or attack them from the right, but can have a critical conversation? And I was not finding a venue where that was happening or where that was a consistent point of view instead of a sort of one-off, like, you know, let's have the crazy radical write an op-ed. And I will just, I don't want to go on too long, but I'll just say that pleasure was very important to us as well, because we thought women's magazines are aspirational, they try to make you thin or whatever, and we wanted to be aspirational too, but towards other things, to make them really beautiful, and to show that, you know, there are forms of pleasure that don't really have anything to do with buying things, but the aspiration was towards comradeship, community, beauty, all sorts of things that you have nothing to do with selling ads.
What can you just say briefly what your critique of Planned Parenthood was? I can think of a lot of critiques, but I'm just wondering what the one was in Lux.
Well,
The strategy.
there are a couple different things. I mean, the reported piece we ran was that clinics in Texas were trying to unionize, and the response was to fire everyone. And so that's obviously bad in itself, but the deeper flaw there is that there are people who are very passionate about reproductive justice, reproductive rights. You know, they have a variety of politics within themselves, but they're very passionate about many of the things that Planned Parenthood says they represent. And so the goal of any movement should be to make those people stronger. They're our best people to, you know, push this politics forward. And if instead you make them weaker by underpaying them and not allowing them to unionize, that does not say a lot for what the grassroots investment is. But separate from that, like, you know, this isn't specific even to reproductive rights, but a lot of, you know, we can stick with that. They're very tied to the Democratic Party, which just means that the Democrats aren't that scared of them. The Democrats have not prioritized reproductive rights for years and years and years. They lip service. I mean, what are we going to do, vote Republican? So there's a lot of make a monthly donation, a lot of, you know, turn up to this rally, but there's not really a grassroots strategy. It's a litigation strategy and a lobbying strategy, which hasn't worked. And in the meantime, they've done things like discourage people from learning to do at-home abortions. And like, look, like I don't really want to have an at-home abortion, but you know, actually they're safe. And it's not helpful to have large organizations saying that they're not. So my only point is, I think there's a large swath of feminism that naturally has gotten, is part of the DC axis, and that's natural, but it's insufficient. And so I think the idea is to sort of engage with what a deeper, more grassroots strategy is. And I could go on about that for an hour, but I'll shut up.
Sorry, I think this gets into one of my questions, which is about, I mean, given that so much of feminist discourse is now showing up all the time in mainstream media, you know, it makes one wonder, what is the purpose of an outlet that's dedicated feminist? And I think one of the answers to that is that it allows us to sort of dig into inter-feminist conflict in a way that might be too risky or too scary to do sort of out in front of the world. So I'm curious if people have thoughts about what are the interfeminist conflicts that we should be having right now?
Or that we are having.
That we are having, yeah.
I used to always say that I wish that the conversations people were having, in their own happy hour conversations or their own dinner parties or their own cohort, specifically intergenerationally, that we could have some sort of forum where we could just talk to each other about those issues and really hash them out, because I think at the core, so many of the things that we actually want are the same. The core issues, the core resolutions, the roots. And so I would always have that visualization in my head when I would feel that tension of being in one of those spaces, grievancing in one of those spaces myself, and then thinking, what if we could actually talk about it across difference in our movements? I specifically named generational conversations because I do feel that there are a lot of schisms about different theories of change and whose theory of change is most effective. I personally am not somebody who buys into this dialogue that I do think has been inherited in some ways, that because we paid dues through suffering, you should pay them too in order to be free. That's a conversation that I would like to have as a collective, to say, I am so sorry for your trauma. I am so sorry for everything you did, and that's why we need to work together to just dismantle all of those structures together. Thank you for creating a world in which I don't have to feel that pain. That is what I want for the next generation. One example of that for me is I had been arguing for many years to amazing feminist mentors I loved that student loans were the top of my agenda above all other issues as a voter. That really pissed some people off. They said, how can it not be repro? You worked in repro organizations, you care about it. And I said, obviously, repro is the means of production. So I understand that. And my means of production have been controlled by the fact that I have been in debt slavery due to Bush-era high interest policies made to make black people poor, to keep a permanent underclass, and to make sure that white upper class patriarchy will still remain intact. The very prospect of having that conversation with some people was so terrifying because they felt like it was off message, damaging, and potentially ruinous to whatever crumbs we were going to get. And so the thing that I would also like to talk about that's related to that is something that came up in an interfaith feminist circle I'm a part of, that feminist theologian Megan Watterson creates, the House of Mary Magdalene. She's the best. She's my author and a friend, and I used to go to her house for this very feminist church where we would have communion of dark chocolate and wine. And one of the women in that space said, I just realized one day that the crumbs are no longer delicious. And that's the conversation I want to have with the people who are concerned about Gen Z voices having critiques. We're concerned that if we were to expand the conversation, if we were to include pronouns and see people for who they are, and to include disabilities and other issues to the front of our conversation, that we would somehow be giving something up. And I want to say the crumbs are no longer delicious. What if we were to think about having it whole? What does that mean? And I think that all the conversations I would want to have would be wrapped up in that somehow we've been beaten into this place where we think that maintaining access to the crumbs is more important than being free.
Very well.
Well, I didn't remember when we had that conversation, Jennifer, and I was like, why don't they have Kathleen Hanna on the cover? There's like riot stuff
right.
going on. Why is it like they totally don't know? But you said, and I remember this, like, well, if they make anything, if they sort of step outside of what their readers expect, all these people will cancel their subscriptions. And they're sort of beholden to their subscribers. The subscribers are expecting something from them. And I was like, that's terrible. That would never happen to us. But, I just turned 60 a couple of weeks ago.
Wow.
And I know that there are things that I learned that I held tight to as a third wave feminist that don't work anymore. And I know that when I was coming up in the 90s and third wave feminism was sort of happening, I had a lot to say, and it was stuff that 70s feminists were like, your political, pop culture, who cares, whatever, it's all about politics. Anyway, I'm trying very hard to gracefully exit the stage and realize that now I'm that dinosaur that I was so mad at, 30 years ago or frustrated with. And I have to allow these other voices to speak. And, my whole time in feminism, I thought that feminism was this great thing to argue, sort of this idea, and the most fun thing to me was to turn the world around and around and around and see what different kinds of solutions you could come up with. I have to say that I do not feel like that is the circumstance that I'm in now. There are definitely things or questions that I would want to raise or things to write about that I know we would get cancellations from subscribers, we would get canceled on the internet. I don't do it. It's the way things are. I'm just going to roll with it. But there are conversations that I wish were more possible. It's really not for me to say anymore. Conference go, I think. Although I'm still happy to be here. Thank you for having this dinosaur on stage.
Okay. Sorry, I got so into it, I lost track of my questions here. Do we want to do the, or where are we this? Why don't you do one about doing the MFA?
Yes.
Well, I'm wondering if you see any disadvantages to running or being published by an outlet that calls itself feminist. I'm coming from someone, from the perspective of I have an MFA, I'm in a lot of rooms with literary people, and when I tell people I work in feminist publishing, often I can sort of see them just turn off because they think, oh, well, what you do is it's not for me, or it's not aesthetically serious. So even though there's not as much blatant misogyny, I still feel people sort of pull away from that sometimes. I feel self-conscious about it, and I do think there are a lot of people who also have legitimate reasons to have baggage with the term feminism. So I'm wondering if how you approach that, or if that's a concern for any of you.
I'm not sure this is applicable, maybe not. But I think about it in terms of when I was attempting to publish my second novel, which I couldn't get published, to be blunt. It had been 10 years since I'd written the first book, and I was shopping, or my agent was shopping this book everywhere, and it just wasn't getting picked up. And I then decided to rewrite the book. Just threw out 350 pages and started over and rewrote it. And I had a friend who knew someone at Feminist Press, and that was the one place I thought, why not try? And the editor was Amy Shoulder, and I'll never forget. She read the manuscript, she loved it, she said to me, I love how political it is. What? I was like, wow, because I then understood not necessarily exactly why other editors were passing on it, but it just clicked for me. I'm like, oh, I get it. This story of a young black woman who finds herself in a political environment in Nigeria and literally comes into her own, thank you, is not mainstream. It is feminist. And so it really changed everything for me to be published by a place called Feminist Press. It allowed me to really acknowledge that I'm a feminist writer, that the things I care about are reflected in my work. And I suddenly was able to make it clear as I moved out in the world with the book, yeah, that's me, and this is Feminist Press, and now I'm part of this community. And it's as though some sort of shutters that had been down went up. And I'm like, that's right. There are places in the culture that very literally and directly speak to feminist issues in a literary space. And are embracing of writers who are very clearly wanting to do that and speaking to that sort of worldview. So it was an incredible opportunity for me to just, I think, more clearly acknowledge what I was about in ways you can't always do in commercial publishing. So I don't think I answered that
No, you
question.
did. You answered
But,
it.
okay.
Yeah, it was the positive side of it.
Yeah, I could go on, but I will pass the mic.
Yeah, I do think about it sometimes. It can sometimes seem that if you label your project in any particular way, including feminist, you'll turn off some swath of people. I do think, though, that we look at the magazine a little bit like an organizing project. And so we're actually not trying to organize all people at the same time. We're trying to identify a community and then expand that community. And so we actually want to find the people who identify with those sorts of politics, or at least are curious about those sorts of politics. Maybe don't totally hold those politics yet, whatever. But I think that it helps to construct a community, sort of like what you were saying. And I also think that I think of a magazine sort of as a machine for training people. So you train editors, you work with writers to get better over time. And I've often worked at small magazines, and so you can't say that you have the same influence on the culture as like the New York Times. You're not a general interest magazine. And so what are you? It's like, well, you're essentially upstream. You're sort of putting ideas into the culture that are a little bit more radical or a little bit more challenging or just weirder sometimes. And you're helping to produce those ideas with talented writers. Often if a writer is writing for a small magazine, sometimes they're newer or they don't have as big of a platform. And it's always a pleasure when you work with someone over time and then they get too big for your magazine. You want that. And it means the magazine is working to sort of assist in producing intellectuals. That sounds kind of something, but and so I think a feminist magazine is doing something specific, which is producing feminist intellectuals and feminist intellectual work, feminist journalists. And often you can take a journalist who's a talented reporter and thinks a little bit about feminism and assign them to something that causes them to ask feminist questions. And then you're developing someone who's a talented journalist in the world into more of a feminist, and they're going to go on and continue asking those feminist questions through their career. And I think that type of work is more likely to happen in an institution that's identifying itself specifically as feminist and trying to work through these questions. So I think it can limit you in some ways, but it enhances you a lot in other ways. And Amy shoulders the shit.
Yeah,
So.
I agree.
Jamia, I wanted to ask you, because I think of you as having worked in a lot of organizing spaces, feminist spaces, organizing that were media, they intersected with media for sure, but that wasn't their primary, publishing wasn't their primary thing until Feminist Press. And then you went to one of the biggest publishing house in the world, Penguin Random House, and even if you just read Publisher's Lunch every day, publishing, mainstream publishing has this sort of terror of people who aren't from mainstream publishing getting jobs. They're just always like, we're doing a bad job with X, Y, and Z, but also we really are tight about how we want these things to run. So I'm just interested in your insights or your observations so far with these, I'm assuming, pretty contrasty jobs.
Yeah, so I really have loved it, being at Random House, and it was, I think it'll be 2 years in January. They've flown by, and what has been so interesting is I often think about what would it have looked like if I joined another imprint. Because I loved Feminist Press, and thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to the Feminist Press team for bringing me into the Feminist Press family. It was such an amazing experience, and I loved going to work every day, knowing that the books that we would publish make a difference, so mission driven, and you felt in the lifeblood and the heartbeat of every day at Feminist Press, in the beautiful authors that we would work with. It was just so special. And when the summer of 2020 zeitgeist was happening, the racial reckoning, all the different names we were talking about, there were a lot of different conversations going on about institutions like publishing and what does it mean. And so when I had this opportunity to go to Random House, I really wanted to discern, what am I feeling called to do in this moment? Because my instinct at first was actually, I am a feminist, I like being in these feminist spaces, I know my family, I know my community, and this is where I need to be. And I also had this deep sort of, I don't have another way to describe it, sort of spiritual knowing that this was the kind of change that was pulling me, like a gravity that was bigger than myself, that was saying, this scares you in that kind of way that you gotta follow. And I felt that before Feminist Press too. And when I really thought about it, I thought, if I were to leave right now, who would it lift up? Who would get promoted? Who would grow? And that perhaps, maybe in that transition with all the things happening in that moment, as I went into something new, somebody else would be lifted up by a door being opened for them to be in deeper leadership. And so that was really the main impetus. And then when I came in and thought about, what I was going to be doing, the idea of working at a generalist imprint like Random House that was started with the mandate to publish things at random. It felt like a place I could be me and be free to acquire on a very entrepreneurial list the books that speak to me, and to have the publishing impact that you get in a house like that for the kinds of authors I gravitate toward, the kind of values that are in those books. So if you look at my list now, you see a lot of feminist voices. You see a lot of conversations about race, about class, a lot of the things I would have been working on in Feminist Press, but in a different context with a wider reach. And so I think for me, the move has felt really good because the idea of Random House is radical. And so because it exists and because there's so many books that I felt define generations, and including mine, like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, there's so many people who had been involved with that imprint that made me feel like, I'm gonna follow the inertia there because this is a place where I get to really work with this amazing team to learn how to direct those resources toward the books I believe in. And so that has been really great. I've received a lot of support and also have had a lot of fun just experimenting with what it means to build a list at this time in a place like that. And I think the thing that's the difference, the big thing for me, because I didn't know what it would be, is that there is something that you get in an indie publishing environment that is just different. That having sales conference with all these smaller imprints, and you have the Radical Publishing Collective, and you're writing your terms to Amazon together, and all of those kinds of things, those are the things I miss. I miss that, the grassroots energy of that, but I also feel like I direct that energy into the editorial work that I'm doing and the cultivation of authors who I really feel the world needs to hear. So it's been a really great journey, and I am really, really excited about what's happening at Feminist Press right now too. That's the thing that I always keep going back to is, I do feel that it was the right call at that time, because I see what's happening with those books there too, and it's amazing.
Yeah, they're probably the best shape they've been in since ever, which is great. It's really great. Okay, I think I know, we should do questions soon. Do you want to close out with that one? Oh, sorry, you need this?
Sure. Well, I guess I wanted to end with something that I read recently. I brought this in case anyone wants to look at it later. This is from a project that some Barnard alumni did in 2011 called I Am Not a Good Enough Feminist. I got really into this project recently. It really spoke to me. It is partly about to the idea, Jamia, that you were talking about sort of generational debt, like this feeling that we can never really pay off the debt that we owe to our feminist foremothers. But the thing that I wanted to read from it was sort of about like that energy that that marginal or that indie publishing can sort of bring into the mainstream. So this is from an interview that they did with the journalist Laura Flanders. And they're sort of asking her about, what is the value of working on the margins versus working in the mainstream? And if you're working on the margins, are you only sort of preaching to the choir, as it were? And Flanders says, I think you always have two jobs. The choir doesn't keep showing up if you don't keep preaching to them. So there is something to be said for preaching to the choir. That's why the preacher comes out every week. That's why they keep showing up. The head of New Directions for Women, a women's newspaper in the 80s, used to say, it is the independent media that brings the issues to the boil, and it is the mainstream that inhales the steam. So, I thought it was a nice thing to end on. Do we have any closing thoughts before we go to questions? Or
I brought a bunch of free bust magazines, and they're at the front table, so please take them, because I don't want to carry them.
So, yeah, oh, sorry, yeah. No, I was gonna say we can open to questions, but I want you to.
No, let's open it up.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? We can. Leora?
Thank you, all of you. This is so great. My question is for each of you. In the endeavor or project you're currently working on, how do you define feminist success? Starting with whoever wants to be first.
I'm always yapping my head off. So, yeah, I was sitting here listening, thinking about feminist publishing, and I was thinking, God, I would hate to work at Feminist Press, because I would have no idea how to define what is a feminist book. I really don't. I want to talk to you guys about that later, because I know who's worked there, because that's a difficult question. So I wouldn't define feminist success. I define success as something that every individual feels for themselves. Someone wants to have a great family and a great family life. Somebody else wants to have fame. Somebody else wants to have a lot of money. Somebody else wants to have a career. I think that's a really individualistic thing. And you guys are probably going to have a different perspective, but I don't feel like the idea of feminism means that then you also have to be blah, 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 something else.
Well, my question isn't about feminist success, it's about your particular project.
Like bus.
Okay, sorry. It would mean a lot to me if people actually realized that Buzz was coming from a feminist perspective, from a feminist place. I feel like we've been having to try to make the same point for 30 years about why we do what we do and how that is feminist, even though it isn't about feminism, just like telling women's stories, women's interests, trying to center and normalize. Our culture centers male experience and normalizes male experience as the neutral, and women's experience is the outside, and all we try to do is just flip that, and that's why it's feminist. But people still don't understand. So for me, if they're like, yeah, Bust is a feminist magazine, that would be just great.
I really love that question. I think that so much of what feminism means for me at this point is to be able to center Black women's lives. Like, that to me is a feminist act. And so I'm a writer, and my latest work is that I'm working on now is another memoir. It's about my relationship with my sister Rita, who died when she was just 44 from lupus. So this is about obviously losing her, but also about our rich connection and her incredible life, and also the question, was her death inevitable? And so I'm really looking at the ways that trauma, inherited and lived, actually is experienced in the body, particularly if you're a Black woman. So for me, success would be to get this book written the way I want, to see it out in the world, and the success would be that people would be reading about this one unknown Black woman who lived in the 20th century and seeing not just her humanity, but the universality of that story. And hopefully, I'd really feel successful if someone stopped and understood the depth of systemic racism as it affects one individual woman, her sister, and all the people who loved her.
So there's so much coming to mind right now. I think at my core, it's a personal one and a collective one for many reasons, and I was very moved by everything everyone said. But you know, if anything that I do in terms of what I'm editing or what I'm writing myself, because I also write, and specifically have been focused on a lot on books for young readers in recent years, writing to my inner child, but I also just am a child-free person who loves other people's kids.
That's the best way to be.
Right? It's the greatest. I'm a very spoiling godmother and cousin and love bug to all kids, but I feel like if the work I'm doing helps people feel free, or if it helps them feel closer to feeling like they have released a truth, that they can be truth tellers, that they can be their own, that they can live on their own terms and not need external validation for their inherent birthright to be 100% who they are and all of their intact beauty, all the messy together, that they could be that, all of us who've been told that our bodies and our spirits are abject. That's all I want. That's success. In any, you know, of course, in this field I'm in, people care about sales on BookScan and all that kind of thing. And for me, the thing I actually really measure the most when it comes to things I put out in the world, it's about what conversation did it start? Who did it connect? Did it ignite empathy? Did it move people's feet on the ground to the action? Did it inspire people to help one another and to be more human? That's what I think success is, and I think just hearing what everyone else has been saying, I also feel like a call for, if it inspires people to connect and to be together in beloved community more, because when I hear what you said about Bust, you know how much Bust has meant to me. Bust has done so much for me personally. I grew up in it, reading it, seeing myself in it, and then to have the opportunity to write for Bust has been such an honor in my life, and I love to write for Bust, and to have the opportunity to work with you and to publish your books and to, I mean, all of those things, to work with my heroes and to be on this panel with my heroes, that is so special. And so it just also makes me think, if it were to make people feel less alone, because I think we're hearing so many oppositional voices about the work we do, where we're hearing the questions because other people are afraid. And what I really want is, you know, when we're having those times, for you on the page through a book, to be able to kind of have that moment of thinking, oh, I put value out into this world just simply because of what I am and the art that I create and who I bring together. So I think those are the things that I want, and events like the ones we're having right now are an example of that, just for people to really know that you aren't alone and that you have a community that sees you.
I guess I have a very particular sort of answer for Lux, and it's a different sort of answer because of the type of publication, and it's funny to listen to you guys. I mean, I can think of a couple of times in my, you know, where like a novel has basically saved my life, you know. I mean, so I think, you know, in the case of Lux, you know, to return to Hooks, if the definition of feminism is the struggle against sexist oppression, then the idea of the magazine is that it makes a contribution to that struggle. It makes itself useful. And so I think, you know, to take an example, the unionization article I talked about, that took a real investment of time and resources and getting someone to report in Texas and figuring out the article, and we put it out, and then one result was that people in the article and people doing similar organizing, we did an event with all of them, and it became essentially an organizing space for them. And then that sort of was useful to them for going forward. And we saw other media pick up around that issue in more mainstream places. And to me, that is an instance of success. That I focus a lot on the sort of hard political stuff we do. Obviously, we do a lot of other things as well. And so there's maybe a slightly separate question, which is what makes Lux a good magazine, or what keeps Lux in business? Those are other sorts of questions. And in a magazine, the most important thing in a way is the mix. Do you have a mix of like sort of joyful, pleasurable, day-to-day stuff, personal narrative, things that make you feel a relationship with the writer, that make you feel less alone, and then also things that then that community turns to and is like, okay, here's an issue that we have to deal with. And so there's like a mix of those things. So I think that's what makes a good magazine. What keeps us in business, God only knows, we'll see. But I think that's how I think about when we're succeeding as a feminist publication. And I should say that speaks to the community element as well. When people feel in community, I think that's something a magazine ought to be achieving if it's good.
Can I revise my answer? Sorry. So everybody here is talking about how this stuff makes you feel less alone, makes you feel seen, makes you feel acknowledged. In a world where your experience is supposed to sort of live on the outsides, it makes you feel like your personal experience is much more universal than you think, and that's a way of being seen. And so, of course, I should have said that, you know, what we want with Bust is for women and readers to feel kind of the way that I felt when I was reading Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret? Just that you're part of something larger, that you're finally
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, with the way I'm feeling right now, with Lieber, it's really like, can we get institutional subs in place, and that will be success, or it's just going to die. So that's where I'm at. But with Daughter, my publishing house, I realized that now I started it. It can be a burden when you get a $50,000 printer bill. It can be a burden, but I started it because this friend of mine that I'd been friends with forever, Anastasia Higginbotham, is a really talented writer and artist, and no one would publish her work. And I was just such a true believer, and I felt like, well, you know, I've published a bunch of books in mainstream houses, and I had some success. I'm not a chump. I know what works, and I just believed in it so much and got so excited about being the cheerleader that was very gratifying, and I just sort of saw it through. And you know, now it's like 4 years later, so, and all these books are out. and I really did feel like I wanted to collaborate with her, but not, I've had a writing partner before. It wasn't that, it was collaborating behind the scene to provide this situation that it didn't seem like any publisher, whether they were independent or not, was interested in. They just didn't see the possibility, and so since I did see it, I needed to do it.
Yeah, I think like the most exciting part of what we're working on for me is just to be building a community, to be bringing great writers into conversation with each other about things that matter to us and to them. That's been so exciting, and I would love to continue to grow that community. But yeah, we're so focused on the practical stuff right now that it's hard to see that vision right now, but hopefully we can continue to make it work at a practical level. Other questions?
As someone, can I just say, as someone who's not mired in the practical aspects of Lieber, it's really been nice to write for you. There's that piece of it too, you know, just to know you're going into something, you're going to be really beautifully edited, that's a given. But also it's like, yep, this is going to be a totally feminist take. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to think about how to nudge my editor to come around to that point of view. I'm going in like that. And that's like liberating. And there aren't a lot of spaces where you can do that. I've done book reviews for the New York Times. I try to be the same writer in every publication. However, it's not always easy. There's always a different kind of editing experience, I'll just say that.
Working with the writers is the reason I think we started it, because we were doing women's review of books, and we're like, we don't want to do that anymore, but we have to still be editing for that.
Let's start
so
a
I guess we
magazine.
can start another one, yeah.
Can I say, like, we haven't given anybody else a
I
chance.
know, right?
We still keep answering this question. So.
Just say your.
Well, I just have this story that I think is interesting since we have some, you're working for sort of a more mainstream publisher now, a bunch of us are still indie. So when I first was approached by Workman about doing this book about knitting, I've been really getting into knitting, and as a feminist, I was like spending a lot of time thinking about feminist perspective of what I was doing and why I was into it and how these things had been degraded and how people didn't realize how much skill was involved, blah, 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 blah. And I thought that a great title for the book was going to be Take Back the Knit. Because there's like Take Back the Night, and it's like feminists doing knitting, and this is what the press is going to want to talk to me about. And they were like, no, it's just going to be called Stitch and Bitch, which is what my knitting groups have been called. And I was like, okay, but still, I think that the press, they're going to want to talk about feminism and about knitting. Of course they didn't. Workman my book would have bombed if it was called Take Back the Knit. And by putting this more, like, they knew what more people liked, the book sold like hotcakes, it was wonderful, it changed my life. If they had called it Take Back the Knit, it would have been terrible. So there's something to be said for like a mainstream take, sort of like a Trojan horse, giving you the chance to get your feminist message in there, and not be so, whatever. It's
I
just a
still
story.
love Take Back the Knit,
Yeah,
but like
I
for
think
us,
that-
I like.
Yeah. I agree. I think, yeah, so.
Hi, I'm Flynn. I'm the publisher of Lux, and I actually really like how we're sort of towing a line here between talking like shop about like what it is to run feminist publications or publish feminist titles and some of the challenges of that, and then some of like the more, what does it mean to be putting feminists into dialogue and conversation with each other, and to be editing feminist voices. I think like what you were just saying though about like institutional subscriptions, I was like, ooh, because I'm like, wow, I've actually never heard anyone give that answer as to this is what's going to support a publication, so like I want to talk to you later. But I think the question that I have for everyone here is when we're thinking about questions of like feminist success, how we get our communities invested in our projects is something that I think we're constantly grappling with, and I think the media landscape is changing fairly significantly right now. Costs are changing really significantly right now, and I think we would be remiss not to mention that right now when we're talking about like what does it look like to have feminist presses of magazines or et cetera, like in 5 years, given what's going on in the industry right now. So in building community, both with your writers and actually running publications or publishing books, what does it mean to successfully get people invested in your projects? And I mean that like monetarily and also like in terms of getting an idea out there and broadly acceptable in like a mainstream publication. I would love to hear what people think about that.
Well, with for-profit publishers, it's not about raising money from donations. So it's really about selling books.
Yeah.
And selling the subs. So it's always just that, and getting that out there.
And one thing I can tell you from 30 years of running Bust magazine is that nobody wants to advertise to feminists. Like, if you're a woman, if you're a magazine or content that's about beauty and fashion, you'll get advertisers. If you're not, you just won't. And all of the websites that we loved, Jezebel, there's no way that they're making money. There's no way that they're supporting themselves. They have to be being supported by the other publications. Other ones have all folded because they can't make money. Bitch Magazine folded. This magazine is on life support. And I'll tell you something now that we have yet to announce, but we actually sold Bust to another company a couple of weeks ago because we were on the verge of declaring bankruptcy and we didn't want to do it. And the only way that we could do it is to be part of some other publishers. And I still don't know if it's going to work.
But you still have to make the magazine that they are the owner.
Yeah,
Like Razorfish was.
sort of. Yeah. So it wasn't. We didn't sell it for a lot of money. It was like
$5.
basically, it was a fire sale. But I was thinking about this a lot coming here because we're going to talk about feminist publishing, and I'm like, you can't really. But with books, I think it's different. You have to more depend on the people who want this content to pay for the content. Like an advertiser-supported model is just never going to work. I don't think for any kind of feminist content. Not because it's not great content, but because advertisers don't give a fuck about feminists. Like that's the last people they want to advertise to.
especially to Lux. Like,
And how do you
social,
do it?
you're
Yeah, I
trying
mean,
to
how do
build
you do, I was thinking about that too.
Well, I mean, so the history of Ms. Magazine was very informative to read because they talk about advertising constantly. And it was so interesting because Gloria Steinem had a proposition, which was that we can get advertisers who usually focus on men for things like cars to advertise to women and thereby shift the market in various ways. And they sort of could, actually, for a while, although it did seem like a big struggle to get anyone to take women consumers seriously for certain kinds of products, even though women do most household buying and therefore are targets for other kinds of products and always have been. But what actually happened was the advertising department increasingly demanded that Ms. prove to advertisers that they were bringing in the kind of demographics that the advertisers wanted to see, which was rich and white. And so the editorial vision for Ms. and the advertising requirements of Ms. did not mesh. And what effectively happened was that the need to court advertisers had a bad effect on the editorial content. I mean, people who were involved say that and say, it was a huge problem we had to deal with. I think Gloria Steinem had written about this explicitly. And so it's really, I was reading that like, well, that seems terrible, and it's true. I mean, I'm sure Jezebel for a long time was supported by Gawker, basically, but that was like venture capital. It wasn't a profit model, really.
And they were print, so their costs, their concrete costs were less.
They're
anyway.
online, yeah.
No, that's what I mean.
Yeah. And I mean, for us, like, it's a mix of subscriptions and finding donors of whom we have not enough. But it's a project, because if you look at any other kind of media, no kind of media is working. It's not even, I mean, it is a specific feminist problem, but it's also bigger. So, like, any major publication now is either, they're not supported by advertising, they're supported by a billionaire who's taken an interest in owning a media company, or they're supported by venture capital, which is going to go away, 5 years later when they decide they want media to make a profit, which it doesn't. There aren't really great models, and I think for us, we're trying to construct like a healthy mix of subscribers and finding some people with money. And in an increasingly unequal society, you have to organize money. And it's a huge problem. Everyone spends a huge amount of time extracting wealth from like a few people. And it sucks. It's ridiculous.
For you especially, I would think if you're writing all this socialist, anti-capitalist content, and then you still have to go to the people who are the most successful at capitalism
Yes.
for the big donations, like, that's a difficult.
Well, I don't know if it's always the people who have been personally most successful at capitalism who are most open to critiques of capitalism. There's a lot of money in a lot of places, a lot of people who feel pretty ambivalent about it. I don't think there's no clean money in the world, and I think it is always an interesting question to us. We think about what money we take, and oddly enough, we haven't had to make a call on whether to take $1 million from Exxon. But I believe it's possible. So far, it's been possible. We hope to make it more possible. I think there's an interesting conversation to be had, which is maybe too long for this panel, but which is that I think a lot of people have been investing money in a lot of progressive projects of various kinds that are now kind of on their back foot and like losing a bit as we see the ascent of the right and are looking for other places to put it. And I'm kind of curious whether that's going to be a phenomenon
Maybe it
that the
should be
left
part
can
of
take advantage
a
of.
punishment, like Bernie Madoff or people who make a lot of money and capitalism illegally should have to donate huge sums like Harvey Weinstein or whatever.
Well, we could just have our own Ponzi scheme. I mean, do it directly.
There you go.
Why didn't we think of that?
So I wanted to say one thing too. I mean, and I don't mean this sort of in a like Berkshire Hathaway kind of way, but sorry, but in some way I kind of do. Yeah, no, what happened?
No, it was me, I did that.
But to diversify, I think, is important when you're thinking about how you're building the infrastructure. There's so many different models. within this structure, and there still need to be new models that we need to reimagine and build. But in the existing models, there are a lot of different ways you can choose to build your model, and you can choose to build it in a lot of ways. So one of the things that I thought a lot about when I was in the nonprofit industrial complex for a long time was, what would it be like to actually have a hybrid model? Because for a little bit of time I worked at a nonprofit in tech where we were part nonprofit and part B corporation. And that's a social good business. It allowed for certain kinds of monies and investors who needed a return on investment but cared about social good to be a part of that. We did not engage with VC, so that was a different thing, but it allowed for that stream of money, and there were rules around how that needed to be apportioned and everything, but we could show with people's hours how much of the work they did for that part of the org and then how much they did for the 501c3 nonprofit as it's designated. And so when I was at Feminist Press, I thought a lot about that in terms of, oh, how are we looking at the funding? If we put too much focus on individual donors, then if something happens where individual donors decide that their focus is here, or if there's a new, bigger, better media thing that people gravitate toward, because that can happen, what happens here, maybe we can have that as a very strong, important part of it, but then also get more public funding and work that through, because then that also allows that stability and doesn't necessitate that you have certain contacts as inherent to something that you would have to have. And then also try to get some sponsorship from corporations and other people who benefit from the good that we do in the world as a mission-driven organization. And to just diversify. And so, I try to diversify my own personal portfolios. And I think that that's something that is worthy of discovering, because I used to have a lot of fear around dealing with money and feeling like it was somehow impure. And I finally kind of realized, oh, me learning and getting more literacy about this and still having the politics I have and redistributing this bread feels good to me. And so that's how I think about it. And I would like to make more bread to redistribute. And so I just think that there's also a real important need for us to be more collaborative about a system that's made us feel like we have to be more competitive, about understanding the money, how we're redistributing the money, who's playing what roles in what spaces to get all the money to all our people. And I do think there's a way to do it, and that we all win when we put our heads together and think about the ways that we can keep it flowing to the right things.
Right, there is ideally a bit of like a Robin Hood mentality, right? Which is like you kind of like get as much as you can and then give it to like good people who are trying to do their work. Yeah.
I hate to have to cut off the conversation, but unfortunately that's all the time that we have tonight. So let's give these
Thanks
panelists
so much.
As I said earlier, my coworker and I will be here for another 10 or so minutes. We've got all of their books as well as Bust, Lux, and Weaver magazine available. Bust is free, the rest of them are available for purchase, so feel free to check us out at that table in the front. Otherwise, let's just give these all another round of applause.
Thanks, you guys.
I just said my job right.